Corruption, a structural scene and moral crisis. A socio-theological analysis of DPWH governance in the Philippines. Corruption remains a persistent obstacle to good governance and social justice in the Philippines, particularly within the Department of Public Works and Highways. Rooted in weak institutions and entrenched political patronage, corruption is more than a structural problem. It is a moral spiritual crisis that erodes ethical values and public trust. This paper examines graft in DPWH projects through the dual lens of political theology and social ethics, framing it as both a systemic and moral failure. Drawing from a review of literature, the study argues that effective reform requires a simultaneous approach to both dimensions. Findings indicate that while structural corruption thrives in environments of weak enforcement and political patronage, its normalization is reinforced by societal tolerance and ethical complacency. Therefore, anti-corruption measures cannot rely solely on legal frameworks but must be complemented by ethical formation and moral advocacy led by the church and civil society. The paper concludes with a call for an integrated approach to reform, recommending policy changes like stricter enforcement and enhanced transparency, alongside church-based initiatives to renew social conscience and promote a culture of integrity. Ultimately, the study highlights that combating corruption demands a collaborative response to both the governance and moral crisis it represents. Corruption remains one of the most pressing governance and ethical challenges in the Philippines, undermining public trust, wasting taxpayer resources, and perpetuating social inequalities. The Department of Public Works and Highways has long been associated with allegations of corrupt practices, including ghost projects, procurement anomalies, and the use of substandard materials in infrastructure. Such practices not only weaken the national economy but also compromise the safety and dignity of ordinary citizens through faulty roads, bridges, and public works. This study examines corruption in the DPWH as both a structural and a moral spiritual crisis. It situates the problem within the framework of Christian social ethics, particularly the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount, which emphasizes integrity, justice, and preferential concern for the poor. By integrating theological reflection with insights from corruption studies and governance research, the paper highlights how systemic graft cannot be addressed by legal reforms alone, but must also be confronted at the moral and cultural levels. The purpose of this paper is to analyze the persistence of corruption in the DPWH through the dual lens of political theology and social ethics, and to propose an integrated response involving both policy reforms and church-based moral advocacy. Specifically, the study seeks to identify the structural factors that enable corruption within DPWH practices, including weak institutions, political patronage, and systemic graft. Examine the moral spiritual dimension of corruption as reflected in cultural tolerance, ethical complacency, and the erosion of social trust. Apply Christian social and ethical principles, especially those drawn from the Sermon on the Mount, to critique corrupt practices and propose pathways for renewal, and recommend concrete measures for policy reforms and church action that can disrupt the cycle of corruption and promote accountability, justice, and integrity in Philippine governance. Through this analysis, the paper contributes to both academic discourse on corruption and practical efforts toward institutional reform and moral renewal. Several studies highlight the persistent and systemic nature of corruption in the Philippines, showing how it operates at both structural and cultural levels. Coronel in 2014 emphasizes that corruption thrives in weak institutions where political patronage dominates. According to her analysis, the entrenchment of political elites and the lack of accountability mechanisms create an environment where corrupt practices are normalized. This is especially evident in public works and procurement, where contracts are distributed not based on merit or public deed, but on political loyalty and rent seeking. In this view, corruption becomes institutionalized, embedded within everyday bureaucratic processes. Batalha, in 2018, reinforces this perspective by analyzing the political dynasty system that perpetuates corruption. He argues that dynastic politicians use infrastructure projects as channels for patronage, ensuring electoral survival by mobilizing resources in ways that reinforce their control. In this framework, projects implemented by agencies such as the Department of Public Works and Highways serve a dual role. They are simultaneously development initiatives and political instruments. As a result, public infrastructure is often captured by partisan interests, diverting it from serving the common good. Kua in 2017 extends the analysis with a comparative regional perspective. By evaluating anti-corruption efforts across Asia, he highlights that the Philippines lags behind regional counterparts such as Singapore and Hong Kong, which have achieved relative success through independent and empowered enforcement bodies. In contrast, the Philippines suffers from overlapping mandates, agency fragmentation, and a lack of political will. These factors result in an environment where anti-corruption institutions are weakened, rendering reforms largely ineffective. The work of Kua thus underscores the importance of institutional design and enforcement capacity in addressing graft. Simulan in 2005 approaches corruption from a cultural and ethical standpoint, underscoring the moral spiritual dimensions. For him, corruption cannot be reduced merely to institutionalized weaknesses. It is also a cultural ethical crisis that undermines the moral fiber of society. By encoding trust, weakening communal bonds, and normalizing dishonesty, corruption corrodes not only on political institutions, but also the ethical foundation of Filipino social life. This approach reframes corruption as a moral challenge, one that requires not only structural remedies, but also cultural and spiritual renewal. Taken together, these studies highlight that corruption is not simply a technical governance issue, but a moral and spiritual crisis that undermines the integrity of both institutions and society. Combating it requires a dual approach: structural reforms, such as institutional strengthening, dismantling political dynasties, and ensuring effective enforcement, alongside cultural ethical renewal that restores values of honesty, accountability, and service to the common good. This dual perspective creates the necessary intellectual and ethical foundation for employing political theology and social ethics as interpretive lenses. By bridging structural analysis with moral theological critique, this study frames corruption as not merely a policy challenge, but as a societal crisis that demands comprehensive transformation. This study employs a dual framework: political theology and social ethics, both of which enable a more comprehensive understanding of corruption in the Philippine context, particularly within the Department of Public Works and Highways. Political theology provides a lens to interpret corruption not merely as a failure of governance, but as a distortion of the moral order in which politics is meant to serve the common good. Rooted in biblical principles for justice, stewardship, and prophetic critique, political theology insists that rulers are accountable not only to legal standards but also to transcendental moral norms. Misuse of public funds, ghost projects, and patronage politics, therefore, are not simply managerial inefficiencies but violations of divine justice and the betrayal of the vocation of governance as public service. Within this framework, corruption is understood as a structural sin, an institutionalized injustice that dehumanizes communities and deprives the poor of resources that rightfully belong to them. The prophetic traditions of scriptures, especially as embodied in the Sermon on the Mount, exposes the ethical bankruptcy of such practices while calling for integrity, humility, and preferential concern for the marginalized. Social ethics, meanwhile, situates corruption within the wider moral discourse of solidarity, responsibility, and the pursuit of the common good. From this perspective, corruption is not only about individual misconduct but also about how social structures, political dynasties, fragile institutions, and the cultural normalization of bribery either enable or obstruct human flourishing. Social ethics calls attention to how systemic corruption undermines justice, corrodes social trust, and perpetuates inequality. It further emphasizes that combating corruption cannot be reduced to technocratic solutions. It is a collective task that involves policymakers, civil society, faith communities, and citizens themselves. In this way, social ethics situates the struggle against corruption within a communal horizon, recognizing that cultural renewal and moral formation are as critical as policy reform. Seen in unison, these two frameworks reinforce one another. Political theology offers the theological vision that corruption is a rupture in both divine and social justice, while social ethics grounds this vision in practical moral reasoning oriented toward the common good. Their integration enables holistic reading of corruption as both structural sin and moral failure, demanding responses that combine institutional reforms with cultural and spiritual transformation. By employing political theology and social ethics, this study bridges the gap between empirical analysis of corruption and the deeper theological ethical reflections necessary to inspire authentic and sustainable change. The framework illustrates the cyclical and mutually reinforcing relationship between structural corruption and moral spiritual crises in the Philippine context. On one hand, structural corruption, manifested in weak institutions, political patronage, rent-seeking practices, and substandard public works, undermines governance and erodes public trust. On the other hand, this institutional weakness gives rise to a moral spiritual crisis where corruption becomes normalized. Ethical standards are diluted, and citizens internalize a culture of tolerance toward dishonesty and impunity. Breaking this cycle requires dual intervention. First, policy reforms aimed at governance and institutionalized in strengthening are necessary to curb patronage politics, ensure transparency, and enforce accountability. Second, the church and civil society must play a transformative role in promoting ethical renewal, fostering a culture of integrity, and shaping public conscience through moral advocacy and social ethics. Together, these responses function not as isolated efforts but as complementary strategies that can disrupt the cycle of corruption and rebuild both the institutional and moral foundations of society. This study employs a qualitative socio-theological analysis, combining insights from social science research on corruption with theological ethical reflection. The methodological approach is interdisciplinary, bridging political science, ethics, and theology to provide a holistic account of corruption within the Department of Public Works and Highways. The study relies primarily on secondary data, including government audit reports, legislative inquiries, policy papers, and official statements. These are supplemented by academic literature on Philippine corruption and investigative journalism that documents case-specific practices such as ghost projects, kickbacks, and substandard infrastructure materials, church documents, pastoral letters, and theological writings are also utilized to integrate the moral spiritual dimension of the problem. Initially, the analysis proceeds in two stages. First, themes are identified from the literature concerning the structural dimension of corruption, such as weak institution, patronage politics, and enforcement gaps. Second, these findings are interpreted through the lens of theological ethical frameworks, particularly political theology, which interrogates the intersection of faith, power, and governance, and Catholic social teachings, with its emphasis on justice, integrity, and stewardship of resources. In this way, corruption examined not only as a political institutional failure, but also as a moral and spiritual crisis. However, this is not enough. There has to be an integrated response. It is for this reason that a three-step process analysis must be observed. First, a structural diagnosis is undertaken to examine the systemic weaknesses that enable corruption, including fragile institutions, patronage politics, and corrupt practices within the DPWH. Second, a theological ethical interpretation is applied, situating this finding within the frameworks of political theology, Catholic social teaching, and the Sermon on the Mount, which collectively provide a moral lens for evaluating governance failure. Finally, the study advances an integrated response, proposing both policy reforms aimed at institutionalized strengthening and church-led advocacy for ethical renewal and cultural transformation. Theological ethical framework, special attention is given to the Sermon on the Mount as a normative ethical text that calls for integrity, justice, and concern for the marginalized. By juxtaposing this biblical vision with the realities of systemic corruption, the study seeks to expose the ethical contradictions in governance practices and propose pathways toward renewal. The paper does not rely on original fieldwork or interviews. Rather, it synthesizes existing scholarly and documentary sources. Its contribution lies in providing an integrated socio-theological framework that can inform both policy reform and church-based advocacy against corruption. While the focus is on the DPWH as a case study, the framework may be applicable to broader issues of governance in the Philippines and other contexts facing similar challenges. Results: corruption practices in the DPWH and their human impact. The common corrupt practices cited, ghost projects, kickbacks, and the use of substandard materials and overpricing, are more than just fiscal crimes. They are direct assaults on human dignity and the common good. A ghost project is not merely a fraudulent ledger entry. It is a stolen promise of a road that could have connected a remote community to a market, A school that could have educated a child, or a bridge that could have saved lives during a flood. These acts of deception directly violate the principle of integrity by presenting falsehood as truth. The practice of kickbacks and bribery is a betrayal of public trust. These transactions divert funds intended for collective benefit into private pockets, creating a system where public service is commodified. This theft of public sources directly harms the poor and the marginalized, who are most dependent on state-provided infrastructure. Furthermore, the use of substandard materials is a particularly egregious moral failure. A road that cracks prematurely or a bridge that collapses is a physical manifestation of ethical decay. These actions place the lives of ordinary citizens at risk, demonstrating a profound disregard for human life and safety. The overpricing of projects serves to inflate this ethical deficit as it compounds the theft and widens the gap between the public good and private greed. The Sermon on the Mount, a radical ethical critic. The Sermon on the Mount is not a list of suggestions but a radical ethical blueprint for a new order. Applied to the crisis in the DPWH, its teachings serve as a powerful critique of corruption, the primacy of integrity. Jesus calls to let your yes means yes and your no to mean no is a direct challenge to the culture of deceit that underpins corrupt practices. This teaching demands a radical transparency and a fidelity to truth in all dealings. For officials and contractors, it means that a signed contract should be an absolute commitment to its terms, without any hidden kickbacks or compromises on quality. The practice of ghost projects is a complete subversion of this principle, as it is built on a yes that is entirely false. True integrity, as espoused by the sermon, is not merely avoiding lies, but living a life where one's words and actions are perfectly aligned with one's ethical obligations. Justice for the poor and the rejection of worldly treasure. The sermon begins with the beatitude, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," and warns against amassing treasure on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. The corruption in the DPWH is a direct violation of these twin principles. The very wealth accumulated through kickbacks and overpricing is treasure on earth, gained at the expense of the poor. These funds are meant to build infrastructure that could lift communities out of poverty, improving access to schools, healthcare, and economic opportunities. When that money is stolen, it is the poor who suffer the most from unsafe roads and a lack of critical services. The ethical failing is not just a misuse of funds, but a direct act of injustice against the most vulnerable members of society. Ultimate accountability. The sermon culminates in a powerful warning about the difference between outward religious profession and genuine moral action. Not everyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord," will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. This passage directly confronts the kind of moral hypocrisy often seen in corrupt officials who may attend Mass or appeal devout in public, but whose actions are devoid of justice. It underscores that ultimately, accountability is not to be a legal system that can be gained, but to a moral authority that sees beyond appearances. The will of the Father includes acts of justice and stewardship of creation, principles that are fundamentally violated by the very nature of corruption. The Sermon on the Mount provides a compelling and profound framework for understanding the ethical dimension of corruption in the DPWH. It reveals that the problem is not merely a technical or legal one, but a deep-seated moral crisis. Corruption is an affront to human dignity, a direct act of injustice against the poor, and a violation of divine justice. By linking the practical realities of corruption to these radical ethical demands, this study argues that true and lasting reform requires more than just new laws or stricter enforcement. It demands a holistic approach that includes a moral and spiritual renewal, a communal return to the core values of integrity, justice, and accountability. To conclude, corruption in the DPWH is not just a failure of governance, it is a profound moral and spiritual scandal that directly contradicts the values of justice, truth, and service. The Sermon on the Mount provides a powerful ethical framework challenging both public officials and citizens to live with integrity and righteousness. By seeing corruption not merely as a policy problem but as a moral crisis, we recognize that true reform requires an integrated response that addresses both systemic issues and the ethical decay that enables them. Ultimately, we must seek a society where infrastructure serves life, not greed. Effective change demands a two-pronged approach, targeting both institutional structures and the moral conscience of society. Here are the policy recommendations for DPWH and government. Transparent procurement systems. The DPWH must adopt a fully digital and publicly accessible platforms for bidding and procurement. This includes making all project contracts, financial records, and progress reports available online in real time. This level of transparency will significantly reduce opportunities for ghost projects, kickbacks, and bribery. Independent oversight. The government must strengthen and empower independent oversight bodies such as the Commission on Audit. These agencies should have the resources and autonomy to conduct real-time monitoring of DPWH projects. Furthermore, institutionalizing community monitoring through citizen audit teams and public forums ensures that accountability is a shared responsibility. Stronger penalties for corruption. To truly deter corruption, there must be swift and decisive justice. This includes ensuring prompt investigation, prosecution, and conviction of officials and contractors engaged in graft. A credible legal system is a powerful deterrent. Here are the recommendations for the Church. Prophetic witness. The Church, through its priests, pastors, and bishops, must consistently denounce corruption as a sin against God and neighbor. This prophetic voice should be a constant reminder that ethical failure in public life is a matter of profound spiritual concern. Values formation. Parish and diocesan programs should be revitalized to emphasize core Christian virtues such as integrity, honesty, and stewardship. These values must be taught not as abstract concepts but as practical guides for living, especially among the youth who are the future leaders of the nation. Partnership with civil society. The church should actively collaborate with non-government organizations and academic institutions that are engaged in anti-corruption advocacy and education. By working together, these groups can amplify their message and create a more formidable force for social change. Liturgical and pastoral integration. The issue of corruption should be integrated into the church liturgical life. Homilies, prayers of the faithful, and parish campaigns can highlight the moral urgency of combating corruption, encouraging lay people to see their everyday actions as part of a larger mission for justice. And finally, the references for this paper.